There's the infamous email from NIH Director Francis Collins to Anthony Fauci, where he called health experts from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard, who had a differing view. Their view was, these three experts, that we should focus our protection on the most vulnerable people in society rather than doing these wide-scale non-pharmaceutical interventions on everyone. That was their view. And Collins sent him this email saying these were fringe scientists, these were highly credentialed people, called them fringe, and said there needed to be a devastating takedown.
You got to listen, you got to hear all sides. Even as a member of Congress, somebody presents me with something, you for this, be for this, and I said, well, who's against you and why? That's how you get to the right place, is if you listen to all sides.
There literally is a grant application from EcoHealth Alliance. Any regular person can look this up online. In the application that we funded, they are describing what is known as gain-of-function research, where they are working on enhancing pathogens, coronaviruses from bats in Wuhan. And what I want to understand is, do you believe thus far Fauci has been untruthful?
Look, these grants show that these are the types of things that they want to do. What was the oversight over the research itself? Was EcoHealth Alliance reporting with their findings to you, or were you insisting that they do it? There is a mechanism in place that needs to be followed. So, we want to get some answers. Well, they said that you're attacking Dr. Fauci. So what I'm attacking is the lack of debate that we are having, scientific debate. Why are we not having it? Why is someone a crackpot? Because they have a scientific opinion.
The crackpot views in the beginning turned out to be correct in some instances.
Pretty much.
I am here today with Congressman Brad Wenstrup. He is the chairman of the Select Subcommittee for the coronavirus pandemic. And arguably, I think people would say the pandemic is probably the most influential event in American life, perhaps since 9/11. And that's why I think the work that your committee has done is so incredibly important, and in my view, hasn't gotten enough attention in the media, particularly sort of mainstream outlets. That's why I'm really excited to speak with you today to help shed more of a light on so much of the work that the committee has done. And specifically, I'm thrilled to talk with you because I know coming up you have a closed-door meeting with Anthony Fauci that's going to run, I believe, something like 14 hours behind doors. And I think that's an appropriate place to begin, which is to ask you, why is this initial meeting behind closed doors with Anthony Fauci?
Well, that's how we conduct most of the investigation at this point. They're called transcribed interviews. They're not depositions. Now, of course, you're speaking in front of Congress, so you cannot lie to Congress. So some of those perjury type rules still apply. But this becomes a little bit more of a roundtable fact finding. When we have a hearing, everyone gets their 5 minutes, and so this gives us a little bit more opportunity to dig deep into some of the issues. It's interesting, one of the things you mentioned too at first, and you talk about not getting enough attention. I'm a soldier. I joined the Army Reserve in '98 before 9/11. 9/11 happened, and sadly we lost about 3,000 people that day. And we went to war for 20 years. How many people do we lose during this pandemic? Across the globe, millions. Devastation to our country economically, and yet so little talk about the pandemic itself. How do we prepare for the next one? How do we fight this fight? And you got to look into all the things such, where did this come from? How did it happen? How are we prepared for this in the future? And so Dr. Fauci was clearly the face of the pandemic from the government side especially, and from a scientific side. He spoke a lot on science. Not everyone always agreed with some of the things that he put forward, but he was clearly the face of it. So having him in for 2 days, where we go back and forth, majority and minority, where we want to get to the bottom of things. It's an after-action review, and he's someone who can speak on so many of the decisions that were made. It appears, I want to know, how much did you weigh in with CDC, with the FDA on Operation Warp Speed? Where were you involved with the COVID task force, both Trump administration and Biden administration? Where were you weighing in? Did you weigh in on school closures, lockdowns, things like that? What was your advice? Why do you think so diligently, especially early on, not early on, but throughout most of this came from nature? Let's get into the science of it a little bit.
Right. So you mentioned this came from nature, as it's a bit of a contentious issue, perhaps the most contentious, is what is the origin of this virus that killed millions of people around the world? And as we know, Anthony Fauci, among other officials, public health officials in the government, one of the questions is, what is, if any, what was their role in this? What was the role of the NIH and other institutions in the United States government in the origin of SARS-CoV-2? Now, your committee exposed a number of pretty revelatory details about the origins of the virus in a variety of ways. And I want to walk through a few of them with you because, as you said, when you think about 9/11 killing 3,000 people, it's incredibly important to understand, to the best that we can, how this thing began. So, in my view, the evidence is voluminous. There is no doubt the United States government did fund what's known as gain-of-function research of concern. Yes. We know not only did they fund it, but that there was work done on coronaviruses in Wuhan that we helped fund. Okay, so that's established through investigative reporting, through revelations from your committee. Now, whether we call it gain-of-function research, whether it's called enhanced potential pandemic pathogens, there's different terms that Fauci has used at different times, saying one was not the other. He has asserted repeatedly, both before Congress and in statements, that the NIH and his agency, NIAID, that they did not fund this type of research. Again, there's a little bit of wordplay between gain of function versus EPPP and these other things. What I want to ask you is, because when regular people look at this evidence, there literally is a grant application from EcoHealth Alliance. Any regular person can look this up online. In the application that we funded, they are describing what is known as gain-of-function research, where they are working on enhancing pathogens, coronaviruses from bats in Wuhan. And what I want to understand is, do you believe thus far Fauci has been untruthful? What do you plan to ask him in regards to that? Because the things he's saying don't seem to match what the evidence so clearly shows. And what are the mechanisms that Congress can use? What is the penalty, if any, for someone saying something untrue before Congress?
Obviously,
there's a lot there. But
you can't lie to Congress, as I already mentioned, and there can be contempt of Congress when you don't answer questions and don't bring forth materials that we may be looking for. But nonetheless, let's look at some of the things. 2011, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, they wrote an article about gain of function or creation of a chimera or enhanced pathogens, if you will. People want to term it. My take, and this is where we want to get some clarity from Dr. Fauci. My take is then, and he was clear in several articles back around 2011, 2012. That he was for gain-of-function research. He even asked one time, aren't you worried about a pandemic? And he said, well, I think the benefits outweigh the risk. I think his feeling was that if we can create this kind of virus in the lab and also create a cure for it, then there's maybe nothing we can't beat. Now, that's me talking, my interpretation of maybe where he was. Are you still there at this point? Look, these grants show that these are the types of things that they want to do. What was the oversight over the research itself? Was EcoHealth Alliance reporting with their findings to you, or were you insisting that they do it? There is a mechanism in place that needs to be followed. So, we want to get some answers to this process. What was negligent? What wasn't? And what was done right?
How do you get around this? What some people perceive as a wordplay between, well, it's not the sort of legalese, it's not gain of function, it was actually, enhanced potential pandemic pathogen research. That's slightly different. Is there, and I don't know how much of an interest that is to you about that precision, but many people have been asking for a long time, saying it's quite clear the things he has said seem to be untrue. Is there a specific effort made to try to pin him down, or does that not matter, pinning him down in that manner? Is this the wrong focus?
Well, the clarity is, can we ask him to define these things? Mm-hmm. if we throw that out there and he says it's not, well, then would you describe what gain-of-function research is? How does that differ from the creation of a chimera?
Right. And from what was described in the EcoHealth Alliance grant application that you approved.
And how does this differ between what was published in 2015 by Ralph Barrick and Zhengli Shi in China, which was the creation of a chimera, and that happened to be the very article that you sent to one of your deputies once Dr. Christian Anderson said this thing looks engineered. And you immediately sent that article to one of your deputies. Why did you send that? So I think we just need a lot of clarity, because a lot of things are things that we're finding. There is a lot of research out there. Amongst these researchers, they were talking about how this looked. For example, researchers out there, multiple, have written on why they think this came from a lab, and didn't just end there. They put also out, many of them, why they don't think it came from nature. Whereas most of the nature articles I see just stop there. They don't even talk about the lab. And so let's get some clarity on some of these things. And in this process of what's actually going on as the face of the COVID pandemic, did you talk to these scientists as well, or only the ones that were viewing that it came from nature?
So to your point there, as we know, Fauci, for the most part, throughout the pandemic, has always suggested that he's open to the idea that this began in a lab, but he favors the idea that it is from a natural origin. And as many people know, his involvement with this controversial proximal origin paper that projects that this was actually from a natural origin. And do you plan to ask him, the fact that there was research in the Wuhan lab, that it was on coronaviruses, on these chimeras, where they worked in this manner, was this just a coincidence then that that's the beginning of the pandemic? These are what I think regular people are wondering. When we know this work happened in a lab, out of all the places on planet Earth, that just happens to be where this virus began. Is there more light that he can shed on that in some way? Because to regular people, that seems like an awful coincidence.
Yeah, well, a lot of times, someone might say, well, I know, and you're not a scientist, so just believe me. Well, okay, that's fine, but I will tell you, as someone, one is a physician / scientist, certainly not a virologist, don't claim to have all that expertise, but as someone who goes home to constituents and is asked questions all the time, and especially wanting answers, and they see some of these things, they want to know, well, why is Dr. Fauci so stuck on nature when it seems like that's based on a lot of assumptions, but we never found an animal that had COVID like we did with MERS and first SARS. We found an intermediate animal, that could have passed it to humans. And then, in addition to that, is we haven't found that, but what about all these other things that have taken place? I want to know, people got sick in Wuhan. Why did it take so long to sequence? I mean, people are following this and trying to understand it as best they can. So he needs to be able to explain this to the everyday American who is seeing things like, well, you all said in the private conversations, we know they're doing this type of research. Oh, this thing looks engineered. It's hard to say it's not engineered. And then you write an article. They write an article, seemingly prompted by him, as they said, that it says exactly the opposite of what they were discussing internally, and they don't discuss that in the article.
So on this point, because the American public's understanding is influenced not only by what Dr. Fauci says, but by a lot of our intelligence community, your committee released something pretty explosive a short while back, which was that they found that Dr. Fauci entered CIA headquarters without a record of entry, and he participated in an analysis to influence the agency's review of the origin of the virus. There was also a whistleblower account in the independent media outlets Public and Racket, where this whistleblower said that Fauci's opinion substantially altered the conclusions that were drawn. So what I want to understand is, have you spoken to the CIA about this? And how unusual is it for an official like Fauci to enter CIA headquarters without an official log? Is this super strange? What would be the reason for this?
Well, I think it'd be fair to ask him, what is his clearance? Does he have a clearance? Did he have a clearance at the time of this accusation? There's a whistleblower coming forward. We on the committee have requested documents pertaining to that, and at some point we would like to speak to the people that he supposedly spoke to, according to the whistleblower. I want to be careful to keep saying these things are
allegations, but not necessarily true.
Exactly.
Okay.
So our job is to follow that up and try and figure out, what actually took place at that time. I also sit on Intelligence Committee. So I will tell you, being on Intelligence Committee, being a physician, an Iraq War veteran, I've always had an interest in adversarial bioweapons. So when COVID started, I was more looking with a friend of mine, another doctor, for what do we do to treat this? How are we going to treat people? What's going on within the body and what's the best way to treat it? We had no tests, no definitive treatment. So we were looking for things like that. He actually talked to infectious disease doctors in China, but in that process, we started finding things like the creation of a chimera and all these other things that were very interesting along the way. And that's what I was doing during the lockdown initially, is researching.
But regarding the various intelligence community agencies that put out differing reports, as we know, there's a bit of a difference between some of them, Department of Energy versus CIA versus FBI. Is for a regular person watching this interview, how strange should they think that is, or is it totally normal for him to enter the headquarters without an official log? And is that totally above board? Is that fine? Or is that something that your committee is looking into and you're seeking documentation?
Well, that is a question, is, how often does the CIA do this? And why, and when and why do they do this?
Do you plan to ask Dr. Fauci, or to some extent?
Well, somewhere along the line, either through Intelligence Committee with the CIA, or in this subcommittee, because, some of these things you start to get into classified information. So the advantage, I guess, that I have of chairing this is that I have been on the Intelligence Committee for 9 years now, and so we've had whistleblowers come forward to the Intelligence Committee with certain things, as well as whistleblowers coming forward to the subcommittee. So at the end of the day, we're going to have to blend as much as we can, hopefully declassify as much as we can.
So certain perception is that this was inappropriate. Well, forget about the clearance or not for going into the headquarters, but Dr. Fauci's influence on CIA or other agencies, and just to steelman this for a moment and say, the rebuttal to that would be, well, he's the nation's top-ranked infectious diseases doctor. Of course he should be talking with our intelligence agencies to inform them. What would you say to people who view it in that way? Are they right? Is it appropriate? Or is it just the way that it's been discussed or covered up potentially? What things are or are not appropriate in your view for his involvement in affecting how these agencies perceive what was going on?
My take in time over the years, we've never really had ourselves on Intelligence Committee with the intelligence community looking into scientific investigations, right? And so we probably have a lot of assets that are very good, and we do have scientific assets within those communities, but how many and who are they, and are they the right people? And that's a question I've asked within the intelligence communities. Who did you talk to? Struggle getting that information, but I have been able to start to garner. I think we have the right to get it, but I've been able to get things like, well, what specialties did you talk to? Why are the intelligence communities all coming up with different answers? And it is important that we know who they talk to, how much they talk to, because if one agency talked to 20 virologists and another agency just talked to a couple of epidemiologists, those are different specialties with different points of view that are going to look at this very differently, and we found that to be the case. And I think that's important. I would tell you from the Intelligence Committee side, one of the things that I think is, I don't think our intelligence community is well prepared to do a non-biased investigation, because I don't think they all engage with the right people at all the right times, and that's why I think they got different outcomes.
So on this point, from talking with a number of different sources, that certain agencies, so the perception was, you see this D&I report and it's like, well, it's a wash. Some agencies say this, some say that, but energy has far different expertise. I think this is what you were saying, basically, that Department of Energy has different expertise than CIA, for example. So it means something different when, and I feel like the media hasn't covered it sufficiently in this way, where they're like, well, CIA says this, energy says that, but actually they have very different expertise, and energy has the type of scientists on staff, and energy is the agency that said, we think this is probably from the lab.
Yeah, see, I couldn't accept just, well, they said this and they said that, and just accept that. And like, well, who'd you talk to? So I will say that just as a matter of fact, Department of Energy has more scientists and scientific capabilities than the other agencies. And DOE isn't necessarily an intelligence agency, right? So they've had their point of view. The FBI, as best I can tell, did more investigating, and I think that that's important, and it was important on who they were investigating with and what specialties, and I think that that had something to do with them leaning towards that it came from the lab.
So I want to shift into something that's a little more macro, which would be, and we sort of touched on this, which is the concept of a cover-up to some extent, and what I would term sort of narrative control. So David Asher, the former head investigator for the State Department on their investigation into the COVID origins, when I interviewed him, said to me, there is a massive cover-up regarding the origins of the virus. He said, there is classified and unclassified information in the United States government that is undisseminated and unanalyzed. 1. 2, David Morenz, who is a top deputy to Anthony Fauci. We have multiple emails, some of which I believe were revealed by your committee, where Morenz was disparaging scientists and journalists and others who disagreed with the establishment view. He was doing this secretly, privately behind doors in emails. And we also have emails from him, from Morenz, this is Fauci's top deputy, who said, don't use your government email. I'm going to use my Gmail so I can't get FOIA'd. Lastly, number 3, there's the infamous email from NIH Director Francis Collins to Anthony Fauci, where he called health experts from Stanford, Oxford, and Harvard, who had a differing view. Their view was, these 3 experts, that we should focus our protection on the most vulnerable people in society, rather than doing these wide-scale, non-pharmaceutical interventions on everyone. That was their view. And Collins sent him this email saying these were fringe scientists, these were highly credentialed people, called them fringe, and said there needed to be a devastating takedown. And what I want to ask you about all this is any of this appropriate for a public health official to have a deputy using their Gmail purposefully, not using government emails, to say there should be a devastating takedown of scientists who have a difference of opinion? Do you plan to talk to Fauci about this?
Well, that probably will come up, but more directly, I want to talk to Dr. Morenz, and get his take on why he said that. And also, we would like to see what actually did transpire with Gmail. We're having some difficulty getting that information, what was on his Gmails. And so look, I've found through this process, when you're dealing with the agencies, it's very difficult. They don't just surrender information, which they should. We are Congress. We are 3 co-equal branches of government. They need to be responsive to not only the legislative branch, but the executive branch and the Supreme Court, for that matter. And so sometimes you see things going to the Supreme Court saying, no, you've got to turn that over. We've got to make that pretty clear. There's a reason for the Intelligence Committee, because otherwise there was no oversight over the intelligence community. So we had to have a special permanent select committee on that. Do want to know why he did that. That would say, like, we're trying to cover some things up, right? That would be the implication. So we want to talk to Dr. Morenz about that in particular, and was it used?
What about the idea of this sort of what I would call like a narrative control in some degree, when you have the absolute top public health officials, Collins and Fauci, in emails discussing a devastating takedown of highly credentialed scientists who had a differing view? Is there some room for people to say, well, it's important for the people in charge to push forth their view that they feel is the best for the American public and for society? That's a reasonable position for them to take. Or is there some area where they can support their own position, but without seeking for devastating takedowns of those who disagree?
I think that honesty wins every time, to be honest with you, and also open hearing. There's a quote from Emerson that I learned a long time ago, and he says, everyone I meet is in some way my superior, and from them I can learn. And I've taken that approach through my medical practice and everything else. You know, you got to listen, you got to hear all sides. Even as a member of Congress, somebody presents me with something, you for this, be for this. And I said, well, who's against you and why? That's how you get to the right place, is if you listen to all sides. That seems to have been taken away. And that email saying this, you know, devastating blow to this. I mean, really, why would you not listen to them? That's the question, you know, why was this ignored? I was doing an interview and somebody said, well, they said that you're attacking Dr. Fauci and you shouldn't attack Dr. Fauci. I said, what I'm attacking is the lack of debate that we are having, scientific debate. Why are we not having it? Why is someone a crackpot because they have a scientific opinion? You know, hear it out.
The crackpot views in the beginning turned out to be correct in some instances.
Pretty much.
So Missouri v. Biden, the free speech case that involves some of those fringe scientists who they were referring to suing the government, it's going to the Supreme Court, and it's on this idea of should the government be the sole decider about what is or is not misinformation, number one, and number two, if they decide something is misinformation, is it appropriate, is it in violation of the First Amendment to suppress the free speech of American citizens? It's a noble goal to try to protect our society, to think we have the right idea, we're doing the right thing. But although that goal is noble, should the mechanism to do that be suppressing the speech of citizens who they deem are spreading misinformation?
You have your belief. Why do you have your belief? That's what needs to be out there. That's what needs to be transparent. And so that's not what was taking place when you start to squelch people that have a different point of view. And as you said, these are well-versed scientists. They can make their case. Let them make their case. Take them down if you can. Have the debate, and that's not what took place. I get the sense sometimes from our government today, especially as we have all these agencies. We only started with state treasury and war. But I think we have people in government, they're not elected. They get to stay no matter who wins the White House, who wins the House or the Senate. They stay there. And a lot of times I think there becomes this arrogant authority. And I think that sometimes they feel like, well, maybe it did come from the lab, for example. I'll just use that as an example. But we think it's best for the American people and for the world if we just say it came from nature.
It sounds like you're describing almost a sort of paternalism of officials saying, we know best, you, and sort of the Jack Nicholson, you can't handle the truth. And as we know, many people were kicked off various social media platforms, or their particular posts were canceled or suppressed because they said, it's possible this came from a lab. That was deemed misinformation. And then all of a sudden it wasn't. We were told masks, don't bother with it. Then all of a sudden you have to. There was all these things. We were told certain things about the vaccine. That changed. And all these things that are misinformation one day were all of a sudden accepted the next. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that in regards, I guess, specifically to Dr. Fauci, because as you said, he really was the face of the United States government response to the pandemic.
The bottom line is, you know, you can change your mind. There were a lot of things. Look, at the very beginning of this, we didn't know about this virus. We didn't know what it was doing, but we started to see, well, these people are vulnerable. And to that point you were making earlier, why didn't we focus on the vulnerable and prioritize that rather than one size fits all, which it didn't. And we'll be talking about those types of things. But the big question becomes, why? Why were you doing this? You know, and so for masking, you can change your mind. There were times people were saying, you know, coronaviruses, typically they dissipate in the summer. Hopefully this one will dissipate in the summer. Well, there should have been a broad statement saying, you know what, it didn't. So we're dealing with more than we thought we were dealing with. And I think that's fair. But when you don't recognize, and you said, and next day it wasn't the next day. These other views only
took
got
quite a while.
accepted
Yes.
a year or so later, by
Right.
the way.
So I want to shift gears before we run out of time. I just want to talk to you briefly about schools, because it's an area that I've reported on extensively, and I've testified before your
Yes.
committee as an expert about American
you.
schools during the pandemic. And I'm curious what you make of Dr. Fauci's contention that he said, I didn't close the schools, I merely gave the guidance. What we've found repeatedly is that the CDC, which, not Fauci's agency, but Fauci and other officials often said, we merely give guidance. And then they point the finger, it's the governors, it's the county health people, they're the ones who pass policy. But what happens is, then when you go and ask the governor of the state, or you ask the county health people, why did you put through this policy? Their answer is, well, it was based on the CDC guidance. And around we go. Do you envision, for moving forward, if there's another pandemic or other sort of emergency, perhaps a health emergency or otherwise, is there a way out of that kind of feedback loop where no one can actually be held accountable for a decision that's made when they're both just pointing at each other?
And I will say it's not only that, and you have the teachers union calling the director of CDC directly. You have the Biden transition team reaching out to the teachers union for guidance. Where's the science behind it? There should be science behind it. And again, protect the most vulnerable should have been the higher priority. So why are we closing schools when we started to realize the kids seem to be doing fine? And we can get into some of the science of that. You know, and so when we talk about these things, explain why. So things I've learned, let's just put it this way, there's things like the furin cleavage site. That was new to this coronavirus. That's what made it more infectious to human beings, right? Well, the people that were vulnerable have traditionally high furin levels. You need furin in your body to cleave that site to make it infectious, okay? A lot of that is in the respiratory system, apparently. So, wouldn't it have been good to have you go see your doctor, see if you have high furin levels. If you have high furin levels, you're really more vulnerable. Those are things I want to see done going forward, but you have to understand the science, to make those recommendations. So I'm hoping to learn maybe from Dr. Fauci, other virologists, et cetera. Would that be a good idea, going forward, that we do, if we see a furin cleavage site, should we tell people, get tested, see what your furin levels are?
What are your thoughts about this idea of what many people view as a lack of accountability? That you have the structure of how things work, that you have agencies or particular officials who give guidance or recommendations, and then the officials at the state, often at a state or county or local level. There are people who are going to listen to or watch this interview, and they're going to say, my kid was kept out of school for more than a year, while their neighbor down the street was going to school every day, let alone kids in another state or throughout Europe. I want to understand, who can I hold accountable for this? Because the superintendent is telling me, I was just following the advice of the experts. And then the experts say, what? We just gave some guidance. We didn't implement this. How does this work where people can feel like there's some answers for both what happened, but moving forward, when these particular interventions are imposed on society? What levers can be put in place to maybe have more of a braking system or accountability system?
Decisions should be made locally, and they should be based on what's going on, boots on the ground, if you will, backed by science, and not some decree or whatever. And of course, a lot of people are like, well, if they're saying this, then I'm going to be held liable. But if you have the exact science, you can make your decisions. I'll give you, first of all, there were never enough people at the table in the whole conversation, because everything was about virus and vaccine more than treatments, more than unintended consequences. What effect is this having on the children that are being held out of school? My kids were able to go to school, okay? Other kids were not. But they went to a private school. So, why are we saying that this is okay? Yeah, keep it shut down. Follow the science. I had a horrible situation where one of my sheriffs called me, rural area, and at that time I believe they had no cases in the county. But because the thing was, they shut everything down, That was the mandate across the country. We're going to shut everything down. Don't necessarily disagree with it. But locally, they had no cases. There's a guy who had been suffering from a painful hernia, 72 years old. Sheriff said they canceled his case the day before. He was in so much pain, he took his life.
Wow.
So why? There's no cases. There were no cases of COVID in that county.
Is there a way of, so on this point, which is so important, these sort of second order effects, we seem to have had this myopic focus on one virus, which is obviously dangerous and important to look at, but without a holistic understanding or what are the cascade of things that happen once we put these interventions in place. And you've been mentioning science a lot of times. A number of people have wondered, well, why weren't there randomized trials on a lot of these interventions? What about NIH and NIAID funding? How is it that schools, playgrounds were chained shut and they weren't doing the type of research? Well, what is the effect of this? What is the effect and just on this point, with masks? As we know, in the beginning, CDC advice, as well as from Dr. Fauci, the Surgeon General, and many others, first they said no, and then they said, this is really important, this intervention. Masks were mandated throughout American life in many contexts, and to my view, perhaps most devastatingly, on millions of American children for more than a year in a lot of places in our country. Yet, in April of 2023, Dr. Fauci spoke with the New York Times, and he admitted, he said, masks at the population level, they really only work in the margins. Wow, what a remarkable admission that I think to any normal person's view, they're basically saying this idea of a mandate. If you say it only works at the margins, that's what he said, years after the fact, what does that tell us about the structure of how public health messaging and public health policies are implemented in our country when you have this person years after the fact admitting they only work at the margins? Yeah. Well, then why were the kids wearing them at a population level for years?
And for example, my daughter was in pre-K and, developing obviously, and she's wearing a mask at school for a couple of years. And afterwards, she was in speech therapy, so she didn't see teachers, forming words. And so maybe that had something to do with it. That's just one thing. But yeah, you have to say what you don't know. It's only fair to say what you don't know. If you're going forward and saying, mask may help, but what type of mask, for one, could actually be helpful? I mean, think about this. If you're suffering from COVID, you're at home, but you're told you're supposed to wear a mask all the time, especially if there's other people in your home or whatever the case may be. Well, I never have seen in our history where somebody sneezes or coughs into a handkerchief and then puts it back over their face, right? So shouldn't that be studied?
It sounds like you're saying that the degree of uncertainty was not expressed. Rather, it was the opposite. It was, this is what you need to do. We're so convinced this is right, we're going to mandate it, even though millions of people are doing it very differently throughout Europe. Children there, young kids, right. The World Health Organization. How is it possible that the science looked one way in America and the science looked differently elsewhere? And not only different, but there was such certainty within which you were a piece of garbage to a lot of people if you didn't go along with these things.
Oh yeah, you want to kill people. Right. That's what was going on out there. And again, when you're hearing from people that aren't out in the trenches, look, I said from the very beginning, America needed to be hearing from doctors treating COVID patients, not the politician and not the person who's just in the lab.
People who are clinicians with them rather than just administrators and bureaucrats.
Seeing patients. Here's what's working. Here's what's not. We're wearing masks, and hopefully that will decrease our chance of contracting COVID from the COVID patients we're treating. Let them say that. You could argue that it's maybe more dangerous for the COVID patient to wear a mask because are you containing the COVID that might be trying to come out with your cough or your sneeze? Are you getting less oxygen because you're wearing the mask at a time when your lungs are crying for more oxygen? These are questions we should be asking and studying.
So before we go, the last question I want to ask you is there something from the subcommittee that you're knowledgeable about as the chair that the American public either don't know about or are misinformed about, or if there's one or a couple things that bother you, that you continue to see a certain narrative play out in the media or elsewhere, that you're like, this is wrong, and how can we correct that misunderstanding or lack of information? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I think it's just the America not understanding the process. And in some ways, what bothers me is there's too much blind following. Americans, by and large, want to be educated, not indoctrinated. And so I think there's a multitude of things that the American public is not aware of, whereas we would have expected our media, the fourth estate, to be asking all these questions, to challenge things that public health officials are saying, because challenging the government is the American way. Approaching your government, appealing to your government for answers, that's the American way. It's built into the system. And we always relied a lot on journalists, et cetera, and many journalists have approached some of these things very diligently, where others, yeah, go ahead, pat yourself. You did a nice job when you came in. You asked the questions and you looked at the unintended consequences. And we weren't getting those types of questions asked by a lot of the media that people follow. And if you're following certain social media, it's telling you these people are terrible people and we're shutting them down. And it's like they're just making a scientific debate. So it's a bigger problem than just one issue. But I do think, bottom line is, and I've seen this in our local communities, you had school boards making these decisions as opposed to a doctor saying, I believe this patient should, for example, only get one dose of Pfizer. He's young, he's perfectly healthy, he has no comorbidities, he'll get good coverage from that. We're finding that with the second dose, myocarditis is setting into young males that are getting this. That should be a conversation with the doctor. Doctors should say to the school, in my medical opinion, this person is fine with one dose, but instead we saw where school boards were saying, you must have both or you can't come in.
And the view you're describing was very commonplace in many countries in Europe, yet was completely unacceptable in a lot of America. And part of that, I wonder, is what you described because of what appeared to be a sort of lack of skepticism of so much of the media. You're a highly placed person in the government. Do you have any insight into why is that? What happened that there was this dynamic that you had this sort of alternate reality in America, whether on vaccines or masks or these other things that differed from other countries that typically we often look to as peers, where we have a lot of similar health policies or respect for how things are functioning there, yet we were doing something so differently. Is it because of the media? And just as a politician yourself, do you have any insight into that dynamic? Why did it play out this way?
No, but I want to find out. And that's why we have this subcommittee, and that's some of the areas I'm digging into with the Intelligence Committee. This should never have been partisan. Were we partisan after 9/11?
No.
No. We banded together.
At least not immediately after.
Yeah, but we banded together, and the idea was we're going to get to the bottom of this and try to make sure it never happens again. That should have been the approach across the board. Politically, I don't understand. It killed Republicans and Democrats alike. So why did we do things that created such a divide when it should have been open debate and openly discussing, what is going on, what is actually going on, what's your opinion, You're a scientist, Well, let's put our thoughts together. Okay, it could be from nature. How are we going to fight that in the future? Okay, it could be from the lab. How are we going to fight that in the future? Okay, from the intelligence side, what is China doing on bioweapons? We need to keep an eye on that, and how are we prepared for that, and where are they with that? So we didn't do that. We didn't do this in a nonpartisan way, which never should have been partisan, but people took sides.
Including a lot of the media.
Based on their political structure, and I don't know why.
We'll have that's round two. We'll have to figure that out next time.
That's right. We got more to do, for sure.
Chairman Wenstrup, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you appreciate this content, please subscribe to the channel, and importantly, go to silentlunch.net and become a subscriber there. Your support will enable me to continue these types of interviews.